is up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Limited Resources. This is episode number 387. My name is Marshall. I'm one of your Limited Resources, and joining me on the line, Luis Scott-Vargas. Luis, how are you?
I'm doing well. We've gotten to jump in early into this limited format, as we mentioned in the set review, and well, we'll see what the results of that are, but we've gotten a lot more drafts under our belt than we have for previous formats.
Yeah, it's weird. I've drafted this format way more than I normally would have by now because it came out on Magic Online. And I've got the GP coming up this weekend that I'm going to be doing coverage at. And I feel like I've drafted this format like a million times already. And that's not even to speak of the Pro Tour, which is still another, week and a half away. And normally by the time I get to the Pro Tour, I'm still like trying to figure out kind of the basic building blocks of the format. And here I'm like already learning these intricate, little plays and all this weird stuff. It feels kind of strange.
Yeah, I'm curious where we end up in a couple of weeks based on that. Each format's different also, so there's obviously some peculiarities with each individual format. But I think the fact that we have this a lot earlier is relevant.
Yeah, and also I've got a lot of stuff to talk about for this format. We're going to be talking about our first impressions for this thing, and what that means is, of course, we've got a lot, right? This is not the kind of thing where these are the type of shows where we come in and we often have a ton of things to say about it because it's brand new, right? This is all this stuff that's just right thrown in our face, and we're just sort of like trying to absorb everything and get everything integrated into our brain, as well as just learn the cards, right? That's a big part of the deal as well. So we're going to be talking about all of that kind of stuff and maybe a little controversy as well here on this episode. Before we do, I want to talk to you about our sponsor, channelfireball.com. Make sure you check them out for everything that you need Magic related. You can get sealed products, you can get singles, you can get Amonkhet, right? All the cool stuff like that. And while you're there, check out some of the awesome free content. There's always great stuff right on the front page of channelfireball.com. There's a bunch of draft videos up. A couple of mine are up. I see there's one from Reed Duke. I know you've got a few on there as well. So you can watch people play, with Amonkhet, get your hands dirty without having to draft, so that you're ready to when your weekly draft comes around at your shop or whatever. And, you can read articles by some of the best players in the world as well, helping you to improve at Magic. And of course, that's content is all free all the time, which is fantastic. And also the show's brought to you by you via the Patreon. That's patreon.com/limited resources. It's a simple and awesome website to help you support the things that, make you happy or help improve your life a little bit. And if we're one of those, well, that's the place you can go to help support us. You also get to ask questions on the Patreon question of the week. This one comes from Will Henson, who says, he's from Portland, just down the road from me from Seattle here. He says, can you guys briefly touch on the difference between a replacement effect like Whining Constrictor and other effects that might go on the stack? Great show. Thanks for all you do for us Magic players. So Will is asking actually a rules question here. And while we are not JudgeCast, we do have, Luis, who you're like, in my mind, you're at least a level 1 judge.
I used to literally be a level 1.
Yeah, so that's why they can't ever take it from you, even though they can, and they did. So, what do you know? What do you know about replacement effects? How those work.
Something like Whining Constrictor says, whenever a permanent would get a counter, instead get an additional counter, right? Something like that. Mm-hmm. Those don't use the stack. So when you play, let's say, a creature like Walking Ballista, that's to use a constructed level application, with X equals 1, you would come into play with 1+1 counter. Whining Constrictor says, nope, comes into play with 2 instead. And it just happens.
Right.
It's not something your opponent can't respond to it by dealing 1 damage to your Walking Ballista.
Yeah, and that's really the key, right? Is that there is not a window of time with replacement effects where you can interact with the card doing what it originally did, but now doing the alternate thing. The alternate thing happens instead. Yeah,
so we have the White Vizier, I believe, in this set, the uncommon, the 2/1 that says whenever a -1/-1 counter, one or more -1/-1 counters will be placed on one of your creatures, place 1 fewer instead. Mm-hmm. That means that if instead of putting 2, you put 1, instead of putting 1, you put 0, and again, there's no responding to it. Whereas a trigger, let's say, would say whenever a counter gets put on their creatures, add an additional counter, and that would say, okay, a counter gets put on my thing, this triggers add an additional counter. I'm not saying there's a card with that exact wording, but that is the kind of thing. Or like whenever one of your creatures comes to play, deal 2 damage to it, that you would have a chance to respond to that because it is a trigger.
Right, and you can see that's a really good example of using that white card. Is that it's that's the reason why they have these type of things, right? Because if it gets 2 counters, but then you take one of them off, well, it would die, right? Or it wouldn't work that way. Right. So instead, they do it that way. Yeah, so it works better that way. Okay. One other thing I wanted to mention before we get in, I was actually down at Wizards of the Coast on the weekend or at the end of last week doing a draft. And I talked to a couple of the employees down there, and they mentioned something that I thought was kind of cool and might be relevant to some of our listeners. So I wanted to just take a quick moment to mention it, which is that there's a new thing that they're starting, which is called Magic League. And basically, these are leagues similar to what you'd think of for Magic Online, but they're for sealed, and they're kind of cool. They're smaller than you'd normally expect. You get 3 booster packs, and you build a 30-card deck. You get basic lands, of course, for whatever, and that's what you start with, and then you include like your 12 to 13 lands or whatever, and then as the weeks go by, you get to add additional boosters from Amonkhet, and they also have it built in so that if your deck receives a 3rd loss, you can add an additional booster. So it kind of helps you out if you're getting smashed. And basically the way this works is you can set them up at a local game store, like the local game store can set these up to play against other people, or you can even do it at home. They have a Magic League that you can do with your friends or classmates or whoever it is that you like to play Magic with. And there's like a kit that you can download. I'm going to put the link in the show notes for that. Basically, it's just like a cool way to experience a little bit of Limited and to kind of get your feet wet with Amonkhet without having to have like a major commitment of a lot of stuff. And I just thought it would be something that might appeal to some of our audience. So anyway, not a huge thing there, but I just wanted to mention it, and I'll put that again in the show notes. Okay.
Trivia. I got back into Magic because of a local sealed league.
Oh, really?
Store. Yeah. It used to be that over the summer when I was at college, I didn't go home. I stayed there because I had a job in town, and I had like a 2-hour break every day and I had nothing to do. So I would actually go to a local store and play the sealed league with this is back in Onslaught block, and you would play, and when you beat someone, they recorded it at the end of the like 6 weeks or something. The people with the best records made the top 4, and I remember that's kind of how I got back into it.
What was your job?
I was working at the dining hall on campus.
Oh, very nice. Serving people food?
Yeah, I was, yeah.
Did you eat any of it?
I ate plenty of it.
One for you, one for me.
Not exactly in that way. I thought it was fine, actually.
No, that seems good. I worked at a restaurant for one day.
It must not have been a very good day.
It was not a very good day, no. I was like 15 or 16, and I was supposed to clear the tables, and I didn't like it. All right, so we've got some packs to crack here. The first one comes from Matt Hall, who I met at the Amonkhet pre-release. Thank you, Matt, for the pack. I appreciate it. And let's get right into these things and see what we've got. So I'm going to be reading what the cards do. I'm going to read them quickly, though. We do need to, you do have to start knowing what the cards do even early in the format. First one is Pathmaker Initiate, which is the one in red 2/1 that you can tap to have a creature with power 2 or less not be blockable this turn. Card's been mediocre.
This card's fine. It's not something I'd want to first pick, but it is definitely playable.
Agreed. Retcrop Spearmaster. That's the 2 and a white 3/1, and you can exert it to give it +1/+0 and first strike when it attacks.
Another playable card.
Agreed. That's how I see it too. Unburden. This is the 1 black sorcery. Target player discards 2 cards, or you can cycle it for 2.
I like this card quite a bit. I actually like this the most of these 3 cards.
Okay.
I've been impressed with cyclers, especially cards like Unburden, which have built-in card advantage.
All right, next is Shed Weakness, which is green for an instant. Target creature goes +2/+2 until end of turn, and you can remove a counter from it. A -1/-1 counter specifically.
I have not been playing a ton of this card, but I think it's a fine card.
Yeah, I agree. It's the kind of card that you have to consider in combat a lot, and that to me, at least as a 1-mana reasonable combat trick, makes it kind of scary. Awashra Cultivator. This is the green 0/3 that you can pay 2 and a green, tap it, and sack it to go get a basic land and put it on the battlefield tapped.
I think this card is very bad. even with the ability to dump -1/-1 counters on it, I just don't think the card is good.
I've been playing an embarrassing amount of these. I don't think it's good either. I think it's actually quite bad. Electrify's next. Here's a first pickable card. Yeah, 3 and a red instant, does 4 damage to a creature.
Yeah. Clear front runner now, and not every card I'm even that unhappy to first pick.
Yeah, agreed. Painful Lesson. Have you played much of this? This is a 2 and a black sorcery. Target player draws 2 cards and loses 2 life.
So I haven't, and I think the card looks fine. I think the reason is when you have a bunch of cyclers in your deck, you kind of used up some of the time you would spend on casting cards like this cycling, and you don't get to just spend 10 mana a game on this kind of effect. So
I know I've been trying to play this card a little more in some of the cycling decks, because I do find that like having a critical mass of cards can be important, but the card is not great. Like it is slow, and the damage
with
matters.
A drawback unless you're finishing your opponent off, which does not happen all that often.
Right, and even then, like, you know, Divination is a spell in an average set that's an average card. It's not like a great card. It's a playable card usually, and in a slow set, it's actually quite good. But we're not talking about a really high bar, and we're adding a significant drawback to it. So it's really hard, I think, for Painful Lesson to, you know, come out really looking shiny in that spot. Slitherblade, blue for a 1/2 unblockable. No, that card's just terrible. In Oketra's Name is the 1 and a white instant. Zombies you control get +2/+1 until end of turn, and other creatures you control get +1/+1 until end of turn. I have seen this used successfully once, but otherwise have been relatively unimpressed. I don't know, maybe it's just like all zombies it's good?
Yeah, I've played against it and with it in Black-White Zombies both times, and it was good in those decks. It was good against me, and it was good in my deck when I played it.
Okay.
But yeah. It's not a card I would take early, certainly.
Yeah, certainly not. Definitely Electrify is still at the top. This is a pretty good card. It's called Manglehorn, 2 and a green for a 2/2. When it enters the battlefield, you destroy an artifact, and artifacts your opponents control enter the battlefield tapped. That said, I have not found this to be a high pick, and I usually don't main deck it either.
No, I think it's a fine sideboard card, but it's not a card I've felt very compelled to main deck.
Another card that's been really just not on my radar at all is Watchers of the Dead. That's the 2 mana 2/2 artifact creature cat, and it has an activated ability. You can exile it, and each opponent chooses 2 cards from his or her graveyard, and then exiles the rest. It's a very strange card. Normally, I'm not really opposed to a 2/2 for 2, but this one I have yet to really have been impressed by in any capacity. I think it's probably just bad in the format.
Yeah, it's not good. I think that a 2/2 for 2 with no abilities is just not a card, or not a very good card. It's playable, but not good, and this does not have an ability.
Yeah, exactly. All right, this next one definitely gives Electrify a run for its money. It's Merciless Javelineer. So this is the 2 black-red 4/2 Minotaur Warrior. You can pay 2 mana and discard a card to put a counter on a creature, and that creature can't block until end of turn.
I don't even know if this gives it a run for its money. I think it just takes its money.
Yeah, probably so, yeah.
It runs much faster. It's a gold card, but it's just so good. Discarding a card from a -1/-1 counter is like okay, but not great. Just if that's all you could do. But making their creature unable to block means that you can just set up alpha strikes, and there's combos of discard and combos of having an empty hand, and this is a 4/2 by itself. So I think this card's great. I would not mind first picking.
Yeah, I agree. I've been really impressed by the Javelineer. Again, not a bomb, right? It's not the kind of card that just takes over, but it is a really board-affecting spell that really does matter. All right, we've got a foil. It's a common. It's Violent Impact. The 3 and a red sorcery, destroy target artifact or land. It's also got Cycling for 2. So we're not picking that. Our rare, Dread Wanderer. This is the black 2/1 zombie jackal that enters the battlefield tapped, and you can pay 2 and a black to return it from the graveyard to the battlefield, but you can only do that if you've got 1 or fewer cards in hand, and of course anytime you could cast a sorcery.
Well, this is a playable card in any black deck, and even a touch better than playable. But
I agree.
I don't think it's as good as Merciless Javelineer, even given the fact that the Javelineer is a gold card.
Do you think it's as good as Electrify?
I would take Electrify.
I would too.
I think that just killing a creature for 4 mana is going to be better on average than a 2/1 that, it can come back, but it's not. It's just going to get brick-walled in the mid-game a lot of the time anyway.
Yeah, I agree. And I have also, you and I are both pretty loath to take gold cards first, but Merciless Javelineer really is a type of card that can put a hurting on the opponent.
It's slightly more than a tiebreaker taking a gold card. Like I would take like a 7 monocolor card over a 7.5 gold card, but Merciless Javelineer is like an 8.5 or something, or an 8, and these other cards are like 6s.
Yeah, for sure. All right, let's take a look at another Cracker Pack, because I like to do a couple of them when the set's out first. This one comes from my friend Alex. Thank you, Alex. actually drafted with Alex yesterday. Ooh, cool island. We got one of those full art islands. I'll make sure to put that in the Patreon giveaway the next time we do it. All right, first card out is Cartouche of Solidarity. This is the white one. It costs white. It's a aura that enchants a creature you control. You get a 1/1 white warrior token with vigilance, and the creature itself gets +1/+1 and first strike.
It's a fine card in like a white go wide deck, but
yeah,
especially if you have some trials, but not a card I'd want to start my draft with.
No, definitely not. I think that I have my Cartouche power rankings all sorted out. And Cartouche of Solidarity is second to last for me.
Cartouche of Zeal is the last one I would have.
Yeah, that's what I have as well. But, to be honest, the Cartouches are just very good. They've really overperformed. And so that's not really a knock on Cartouche of Solidarity as much as it's just, seeing how good the other ones are. Hey, look, it's number 3 on the Cartouche power rankings, Cartouche of Knowledge. This is 1 in a blue. So the blue Cartouche, and the creature gets +1/+1 in flying, and you draw a card when it enters the battlefield. I've liked this one quite a bit too.
Yeah, it's great, especially in blue-green. The only time I haven't liked it in a base blue deck is in like red-blue spells, because you have so few slots for cards that aren't a creature or an actual literal spell like a instant or sorcery. But other than that, I think the card's great.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. That's. I think that you noted it. The green deck, it's really the best. I mean, you haven't lived until you've been hit by a greatest slagworm or whatever it's called,
yes.
sandworm, flying over and smashing you in the head.
Just while we're here, is Cartouche of Ferocity the number 1?
Is that what it's called? Strength, right?
Strength. Yeah.
Strength is number 1, and black is number 2. Yes. Yeah. Brute Strength is next. Speaking of strength, this is 1 in a red for an instant. Target creature gets +3/+1 and gains trample until end of turn. This is what we call a playable combat trick. It is certainly not a card we're going to take first. All right, here's one I wanted to ask you about, because I think I've liked this guy. It's Soul Stinger. 3 in a black 4/5. Yeah, when it enters the battlefield, you put 2 -1/-1 counters on target creature you control. But here's the catch. When Soul Stinger dies, you can put a -1/-1 counter on target creature for each -1/-1 counter on Soul Stinger. So you're pretty incentivized to put the counters on Soul Stinger itself, even though you only get a 2/3 out of the deal. It can often kill something when it dies. And then if you need a 4/5, of course, you can dump the counters somewhere else. So where are you at on Soul Stinger?
I like Soul Stinger. I've been playing it in every black deck. Not even just the ones that have -1/-1 counters as a theme, because 4 mana for a 2/3 that when it dies distributes 2 -1/-1 counters on a creature is a pretty good roadblock. It can take down a bigger creature in combat. It can chump their 5/5 and kill their 2/2 flyer, etc. And then you also have stuff like the counter deck where maybe you put more counters on this one. Like you can kill this with -1/-1 counters and give like 5 counters to something, or you put 2 counters on your like Vizier of Tumbling Sands and end up with just like a 4 mana 4/5. So it's got power plus flexibility. I like that combination.
Yeah, for sure. I've been impressed by it. 4 drops a little thick on this set from what I've seen. Like there's a lot of playables, but still Soul Stinger's a real card. Pouncing Cheetah. This is the 2 in a green 3/2 with Flash. I have not been that impressed by the poor Pouncing Cheetah here.
I think it's unplayable. Yeah. I think that you have to have a specific reason, like they have a bunch of 5/3s or something.
Yeah. I lost to it the other day thinking my opponent wouldn't play that, would they? And then they're just like, bang. I'm like, oh no. Nephcrop Entangler. This is the 1 in a red 2/1 with Trample. And it has Exert. It gets +1/+2 until end of turn when it attacks.
I think this card is certainly playable in an aggressive red deck. But
definitely.
Not a card I would want to start the draft.
No, I'm still on Soul Stinger or maybe Blue Cartouche here as my first pick.
Not an appealing crop.
No. Next, by the way, we may complete our Cartouche power rankings just in this pack, and we've already done it for you verbally, but we've got Cartouche of Ambition. That's the black one. So 2 in a black, creature gets lifelink and +1/+1, and you put a -1/-1 counter on a target creature.
This card is overperformed.
Definitely.
I think that it has gone from like what we probably gave this like a C or a C plus. It's like a B minus.
I agree. Yeah, it's been great.
Basically, it kills one of their small creatures or shrinks one of their creatures, but then gets you like a hit for 4 or 5 of lifelink. Like this is one of the cards that swings games so frequently. So right now, this is my pick in this pack.
Yeah, and one of the combos that I've really loved is your Crocodile, the 6/7.
Yes, the 6/7 hexproof.
Yeah, with a Cartouche of Ambition or Cartouche of really anything is pretty nice. Next is a card that I think is a little underrated right now. It's Shimmer Scale Drake. That's the 4 and a blue 3/4 flyer with cycling 2. It's not as flashy as some of the other cards that you'll see around, but I've been really impressed by Shimmer Scale Drake as both a body in the air as an attacker or blocker, and then the pressure release valve of having cycling is something that, of course, we all value very highly, and I think that the Drake's a really solid common in blue.
I like Shimmer Scale Drake a lot. I think it is underrated, like you said. I keep getting them with 5 cards left in the pack.
Yeah.
Like 5 mana 3/4 flyer used to be just a gem in limited. It's not anymore. Formats tend to be a little bit more powerful these days, but adding cycling is just so big.
Yeah. I think the card's really good. I agree. All right, here's cards that I haven't even bothered playing with yet. Cradle of the Accursed. There's like this 3 or 4 of these colorless producing lands that have an effect. This one seems to be fine. It taps for colorless. It's a desert. And then you can pay 3 mana, tap it, and sack it to make a 2/2 zombie. You can only do it anytime you can cast a sorcery.
I have not had very many decks where it's worth the mana inconsistency for this. I had a mono black deck actually where it was good. And in white-black zombies, it's probably worth inconsistency because getting a zombie is just so important. But should you put this in your random blue-green deck? The answer is no. Should you first pick it? Certainly not.
Absolutely not. Oashra Cultivator, again, that's the green one that searches up a land. We're not taking that. That leads us to our uncommons. First one's a nice one. Wayward Servant. You said that you had a few zombie decks. Was this card in it?
Yes. This is a white-black for a 2/2, and whenever another zombie enters the battlefield under your control, your opponent loses a life and you gain a life.
Yeah. Powerful little card.
Yeah, this is very good. Would I take it first pick? Out of this pack, I would, I think, just because the payoff is worth it. It is not a card I tend to want to first pick, because not only is it a gold card, it's also a tribal gold card, so it's like asking 2 different conditions of you. Mm-hmm. But I think that I'll take a card this card can be like a 9, in the right deck. When you have like a 16 zombie deck, this card is absurd. It's just draining for 1 to 2 every single turn.
Yeah.
So I would first pick it here and not be too unhappy about that.
All right, well, let's just see what else we got in the pack for you here. Flameblade Adept is our next card. It's red for a 1/2 with Menace, and whenever you cycle or discard a card, it gets +1/+0 until end of turn. Have been wildly unimpressed by Flameblade Adept.
This card is not really worth it. Just basically, it's an aggro card, which makes you want to beat your opponent down and quickly reduce their life total, but spending mana cycling on turns like 2 through 4 is not how you develop your board. Like, it's not how you curve out. So this is not that great in the late game either. So it doesn't really have a good place, I don't think.
Right. I don't like it. Ooh, I like this next one a lot, though. This one I actually would take over the Wayward Servant as well. This is Baleful Amonkhet.
This is 2 and a black for a 4/3. And when it enters the battlefield, put a -1/-1 counter on target creature you control. It has lifelink.
Yeah. This card's very powerful. I'm a big fan of it.
I don't think I like it more than Wayward did, but I don't know. What do you think?
Than Wayward Servant?
Wayward Servant.
I do. I like it significantly more. Like this is a classic situation for me where the Wayward Servant has a high setup cost, like you mentioned, for a couple of different reasons, being gold and being tribal. The tribal's not as important here because if you are these 2 colors, you just are zombies. Like that's what these 2 colors do almost all the time. But for me, the Baleful Amonkhet is close on power level and in some scenarios just better than Wayward Servant anyway. And it doesn't have a setup cost really at all. Like in your absolute worst case scenario, it's a 3 mana 3/2 lifelink, which I would already play. And so for me, I think Baleful Amonkhet is significantly, I would take it easily over the Wayward Servant.
All right, that's fair. I think right now I might take the Servant, but I think it's close.
Okay. Oh, cancel that order. We got a rare. And this is one that didn't necessarily jump out as a complete bomb, but I can assure you after having played with it, and anybody who's watched my last video on Channel Fireball will also agree, Insult to Injury.
Oh, this is just one of the best cards in the set.
It's just a house. This card's insane. So Insult, this is, of course, an Aftermath card. So Insult is the first half. It's 2 and a red, sorcery. Damage can't be prevented this turn. Not a good start. That's not really what you want to hear. But it says if a source you control would deal damage this turn, it deals double that much damage instead. So source meaning any spell, any creature, whatever it is, if it's doing damage, it does twice as much. And then the real kicker here is injury. Also 2 and a red, sorcery. Of course, it's Aftermath, so it can only be cast from your graveyard. But it says injury deals 2 damage to target creature and 2 damage to target player. But as we mentioned during the set review for the rares and mythic rares, I put those in air quotes because it's really a lot of times 4 damage to target creature and 4 damage to target player if you manage to cast insult to injury in the same turn, which is definitely your goal. When you have this, though, I mean, you can win other ways too. But I would windmill this card. This card's just been insane.
Yeah, it basically kills one of their, like, not necessarily the biggest creature, but one of their creatures, deals 4 to them, and then you attack them and they die.
Yeah, and then they die. Yep, that's exactly how it works. So they're down 4, they're down a creature, and then they're taking infinite damage. I love this card. I don't love that it exists. This is the type of card that's kind of frustrating to play against because you can feel like you're in a pretty darn good position, and then they go insult injury, and it's like, wow, I just lost that game. I can't believe it. And I have to say, one of the things I'm going to be ranting about here in a few minutes is that there's a lot of cards like this in the set that just sort of come out of nowhere and kill you. The thing that I don't mind about this particular one is that it's rare. So, it doesn't happen super often. And, it's okay to have powerful spells at rare. I think that have big swinging effects. I don't really mind it that much. But this one is just one on a heap of cards that can do similar things. But yeah, I would take insult to injury in this pack for sure.
Yeah, same.
Okay, so let's get into our first impressions. What do we want to start with? Because there's a lot of things going on in this set. There's people on Twitter and such saying that it's the best set ever. I don't agree with that currently, though maybe it'll mature into that. There's a lot of new mechanics and new things going on. Where do you want to start?
I think I want to start with the biggest thing about the new set, which is cycling. I think.
Oh God, I need to talk to you about cycling. Yes,
yeah.
Go.
So cycling has a lot of effects in the format, and it's actually part of why I think I'm less happy with the format than I thought I would be during the set reviews. So some of the effects of cycling on the format. First of all, I think you tend to want a lower land count when you have enough 1 and 2 mana cyclers.
Okay, we need to talk. Tell me when I can talk to you about this, because I have questions. Go ahead, make your point, and then let me in. Yep.
Yeah, for sure. And because you're able to cycle to hit land drops, you actually don't need to play as many as you normally do. And actually, the only reason you have to play even like 15 or 16 as opposed to something like 14 is actually color count. You can't really run a 2-color deck very well on like 7/7. You kind of need 8 or 9 sources of your primary color at the very least, and like 7 or 8 of your secondary, or just like 8 or 9 of each if you're playing just 2 split colors. But in terms of actual, like, how many lands do I need to have in play to cast my spells, you could run fewer. It's just hard because if you can't keep a hand of Swamp 2 River Serpent, right, that has cycling blue.
Right.
So you do need to play enough islands to make sure you can cycle. So that ends up putting you in a spot where you actually end up flooding out a little bit because your ratio of lands to spells gets a little bit worse once you factor in that you cycle 3 or 4 times. And it's kind of like you're playing a 36-card deck, but still with like 16 or 15 lands, which is not as good of a ratio as like a 17-land 14-card deck in terms of spells to lands.
Okay. So I need you to tell me if I don't approach it that way.
Okay.
And I kind of don't grasp what's going on here because I've had people ask me about this too. They're like, well, how many lands should I run? That kind of thing. Now, I want to make sure that we differentiate this because there is a cycling deck in the format. In fact, there's maybe even a couple of them. That's fine. That's a different animal. But let's just say you're running, a blue-green deck or whatever. Some deck that's looking to cast its spells. And you're going to have some number of cycling spells in the deck because that's just how this format works, right? I don't want to cycle my spells. Like, I want to hit my land drop and play my spells, right? Now, in the times when I don't get to do that, I will cycle my spells, right? To make sure that I do hit my land drops or that if I'm in a situation where I need certain things, right? Like, a removal spell or a certain, a creature that I don't have or whatever, then I will, of course, default back to cycling. But I don't put the cards in my deck outside of those cycling specific decks with the idea that, I'm going to put this River Serpent is just so that I can cycle it, right? Like, I want to cast the spells that I'm putting in my deck. Am I approaching this wrong?
I think there's a slight difference here. First of all, I'm not advocating playing 14 land. I'm saying I play 16, which is like 1 fewer than I would normally play.
Okay.
And if we're being honest, I think normal formats you should probably play 16 probably a little bit more often than people do. People tend to just stick to 17 as a default. Part of the reason to play a 16 land deck is that it's not that you want to cycle, not that you put River Serpent in your deck to cycle it. It's that you get to play a deck where your high-end cards tend to have cycling, so it's not a disaster if you don't hit your 5th land drop, and it's much, much better to be sitting on 4 or 5 lands the whole game and the rest spells for most decks. Most decks would rather draw like 5 lands than 8 lands, right?
Sure, sure.
So you get to play like a land maybe 2 fewer than normal, because if you get stuck on 4 or 5, you never have uncastables in your hand because almost all your expensive spells have cycling. A lot of the 6+ drops have cycling. Your sandworms and your river serpents and your horrors of the broken lands, what have you.
Yeah.
So it's not that you put a bunch of cards in your deck wanting to cycle. I'm not playing a bunch of Scarab Beasts outside of a deck that triggers on cycling. I don't think you should do that. But when my good cards have cycling, I'm a little prone to cheat on lands in a sense, because I'd rather draw like a land too few and cycle a card than draw 3 lands too many.
Okay, so that's the difference, is that you're willing to just say, okay, I can take a little bit more risk on by playing 1 fewer lands, knowing that I have a viable outlet for that, rather than you saying, well, we should really, in a perfect world, we should be playing 14 lands or even, 15 or even 14 lands because we're cycling so much. Because again, what I've seen is that people cycle too much. Like, it's turn 4 and you've got a 6-drop in your hand, and it's a cycling 6-drop, and they're just like, I'll just cycle it and see if I can find something. And I'm like, you've got a land in your hand. Like in 2 turns, you're going to cast a 6-drop. Like that's just like, what do you
cycling your river serpent to hope to draw a good 6-drop?
Right. Like, so you hope you find a 6. And I keep coming into this where when I watch people, it kind of feels like they just get to the point of a game where they're like, I don't have anything to do right now. I will cycle.
Yeah,
that I don't like that because it screws up your mana to spell ratio, and it also cuts you off of casting big impactful spells in a few turns. So that's the thing that I've struggled with, is that I don't want to reduce my land count that much. I totally get what you're saying. Going down to 16 makes sense, but I don't want to go down to 15 or 14 based on the fact that I could cycle away. Like, I'd rather just play a normal deck and not be forced to cycle all the time. Well,
also, if you play against an aggro deck and your first 3 turns are like cycle, you're just going to lose.
Yeah, you're dead.
So you don't actually always have the time to just cycle all your late claims and what have you. Okay,
cool. All right. I feel better about that. I like the idea of hedging one way or the other. Like, if 17 is a conservative number and the ideal number is, 16.3 or whatever, and you just can't put a third of a land in your deck, then I like the idea of hedging down and being willing to cycle a little bit more often, just to make sure that you do hit your lands in the times when that doesn't come together. That makes perfect sense to me.
It's not even that 17 is conservative exactly, or maybe conservative is a good word for it. It's the risk of ruin of not being able to cast a spell is so high.
Yes.
And that risk of ruin is greatly mitigated when those spells have cycling. So you get to play the right number, which is actually 16.
Right.
As opposed to 17. It's like looking at it this way. You want to, I think in a game of limited, probably draw about 1/3 lands, 2/3 spells is going to be pretty good. Mm-hmm. But we play 40% lands around instead, or certainly more than 33%, because of the risk of ruin. Missing your 3rd land drop is a disaster. Cycling just makes that less likely, so you get to play closer to the actual ratio.
Yep, that makes perfect sense.
Another thing cycling does is it lets you main deck situational cards like Stinging Shot, various types of disenchants, Unburden, and it doesn't have a monstrously large effect on the format, but it does mean your opponent's just going to have Stinging Shot or a way to kill your enchantment or a Mind Rot that they would not normally have in their deck. You get to see these not only in game 1 but in games 2 and 3 more often, because the cost is so much lower. You are playing a black-green deck that has the 3/2 flying Death Touch flyer. Normally, no one would ever in the right mind side in a kill target flyer against you, but Stinging Shot could still just easily be in your opponent's deck, and then they'll Stinging Shot your 3/2 flyer, and it's just going to be a little worse for you.
Yeah, it's weird because you're kind of downplaying it, but I actually think it's a big effect on the format, and it's because each of these is a small thing. Like Stinging Shot your Bone Picker, okay, fine, it happened, whatever. But when I first saw these cards, right, and we're talking about the situational cards that are the type of cards in Limited that we talk a lot about during the set review, because if you put them in your deck, when they're good, they're very good, but when in a lot of scenarios, they're very bad, and that makes them really interesting and difficult to evaluate and difficult to decide when to put in your deck. Man, so many of them just have cycling now, where they just taken away the downside to all of these cards, and you just get nailed with them constantly.
Yeah, you're going to run into basically more answers than you would normally, because these cards tend to fall into the answer category.
Yeah, and so some of them, like the one you said, Stinging Shot, your Bone Picker. Okay, that's a 1-for-1 removal spell. A very good one, right? 1 mana at a green to kill a 4-drop-ish creature is like, wow. But, okay, fine. It's still a 1-for-1, with a creature, which is something that you usually have a lot of in your deck. But, there's cards like Forsake the Worldly, which is the Naturalize, the 2 and a white with cycling. Yeah. And to me, I find cards like that really annoying, because one of the things that we love about Limited are build-around cards. And a lot of the build-around cards in this set are enchantments. Yeah, and some of them are artifacts. Yeah, Drakehaven is one of them. The black, cycling payoff. Yeah, and I mean, even if you go all the way up the chain, and this is a little different, but still, this to me is a great example, is Sandworm Convergence.
Right. You build your deck based around Sandworm Convergence. It's like green ramp control deck, maybe with some draw twos. You slam this, and their opponent's like, well, I just have this card in my deck because it cycles,
Yes.
Just exile it.
and then they just exile it, and that's it. And your whole plan goes away. Other cards that I think are just generally unfun, and I like that you get punished for putting them in your deck, and now you kind of don't, are cards like Censor and Haze of Pollen, right? These cards that are situationally very, very good, and in every other spot, they're really bad. And again, that sounds like a gift, right? It sounds like, oh, they give us all these toys that now we don't have to worry about the downside. But here's the thing that really stands out to me. When I think about Limited, when I approach Limited, when I build decks, when I think about cards, this is the interesting part to me, is the risk versus reward, right? It's do I really want to put this card in my deck, even accepting the fact that it could be really bad? Right, a great example of this is the I can't remember what it's called, but +2/+0 until end of turn to all your attacking creatures. Right. That's a type of card that when I look at that, I go, that's powerful. That's a powerful effect, right? If I can build my deck such that I have a whole bunch of small creatures and I'm in a relatively aggressive stance, I can really make that card great. And it's really cool too, because not that many decks want it, so I can probably pick up that pretty late in the draft, and that's a really neat little, interaction that you can go for. Here, but of course, the downside being that if you're not the aggressor in a certain situation, or if you haven't managed to really go wide, it only affects your attacking creatures, and it ends up being a really big liability. So it's a big payoff, but it's also a big liability. And there's a lot of tension there about, do I put this in my deck? Am I this type of deck? Now that tension's just gone. If you even have a remote chance of being able to use it, you're like, sure, why not? You throw it in your deck, and the only tension you have is, well, do I have a few too many cyclers in this deck? Right? And that's just not as, consequential or interesting to me from a deck building and card evaluation standpoint, when you just take the downside off of it and turn it into, well, it just cycles, whatever. And there's other cards like this too, even cards like Greater Sandworm. I call him the greatest Sandworm. A 7-drop. That's another card that it's like, do you want to really put a 7-drop in your deck?
Well, yeah, but I do. But see, the thing is, when I put a 7-drop in my deck, I mean it, and I'm willing to take the consequences of drawing it in my opening hand.
Yeah, and now now there are none.
With your greatest Sandworms, don't you just put that in your deck and suffer no consequences?
Right, now we're all just LSVs running around, except for some people do cycle it. Yeah.
I would rather miss my 3rd land drop than cycle the Sandworm, obviously.
Yeah, of course. You might still get there. But, there's a lot of cards like this in the set. There's the Threaten, right? Yeah. That's another card that's not very good if you're behind. And it's a card that you have to consider a lot before you put in your deck.
It's a very hit or miss card. It's like a 10 or a 0. It's the best card ever when it's good, because it just kills them. Yeah. Or it's completely dead otherwise. Giving it cycling just makes that so much less interesting. And I think what you're hitting on here is actually keying in onto why I think this format's not going to be one I enjoy that much. And I think that players might have some amount of disillusionment as well.
Okay.
Cycling reduces variance is what you're saying. Yes. You're saying, hey, when I put a disenchant in my deck, I want to feel clever because I sideboarded in. I want to take the risk of it being dead, but with the upside of when it kills a card, it kills your opponent's best card. Mm-hmm. Or I want to put a 7-drop in my deck, and I know it's bad when I draw it on turn 3, but it's so good when I top deck it on turn 8.
Right.
Well, adding cycling to those cards just makes them uninteresting in the sense that you cycle it when it's bad, and when it's good, it's good. You didn't pay a risk, so there's no peak. There's no excitement level there. You don't feel as clever, as smart.
Yeah.
You don't you don't feel the like tension of like, oh, I can draw this and it's bad. It means that, players just have a more consistent experience, just overall, not even with just cards like this, even just giving every card in your deck cycling, which isn't exactly what's happening here. But, I'd say the average deck has three to four cyclers, and a lot of decks have like 6 or 7.
Yep, that's right.
You end up with people casting 5-drops on turn 5 more often, with people, hitting their land drops more often. And yeah, I can understand why players like that. And especially good players tend to love it, right? They're like, yeah, this is great. You never get flooded or screwed. It turns out that I think variance is great. I've done some sign-offs based on that. We've talked about it during the show a bunch of times. Variance is fun. People think they don't like it, but they love it. It's actually great. And variance reducing mechanics run the risk of making it so your 14th match of Amonkhet is going to feel a lot closer to your 30th match than in a random format, right?
Yep.
You're from game to game, you're going to get less variation. There is less variance in this format because situational cards get exchanged for the top of your deck, because you're more likely to hit your 4th land drop or 5th land drop because a bunch of cards are cycling. You're also more likely to play a 6-drop, because you get to put more 6-drops in your deck. And that makes the game blend together a little, and it's, I think, a reason that burnout on this format, we're going to start seeing that at a higher rate than you would other formats. So it's a fine line to toe. I'm not saying cycling is intrinsically a bad mechanic. I think cycling has some really good upsides to it, but there's a lot of cycling in the set, like a lot, way more than something like Shards of Alara had cycling, but there was just not nearly this number of cards.
Yeah.
And what that ends up meaning is that I think that Amonkhet has taken out, just the amount of cycling has taken out enough of the variance that we're going to end up seeing. We're just going to end up seeing like a lot of the experiences be the same or feel the same, which is important, at a rate that I think you're starting to feel already. You're a week and a half in. Yeah.
The other thing that occurred to me that I want to pick your brain about, because I'm having a hard time kind of piecing this together. It's more of a feel thing, I think, but so if overall the variance is reduced, and that has some benefits and some costs, right, which you just outlined, the strange thing for me is if we focus not on cycling in general, where I think we think more about making sure we hit our land drops or don't flood, that kind of thing. If we focus on these situational cards that we were just talking about, the really weird phenomena that I've experienced is that it feels like the format is more variant because of these. And what I mean by that is, like, if let's say that our opponent's playing Stinging Shot that we talked about earlier, and they see our deck and we don't have any flyers, and they know we're just not going to have any flyers, so they just cycle it. You don't really think about that. You just go, oh, okay, they cycled it, they drew something else. It's gone, whatever. But I'll tell you what, the time when they nail your flyer with a Stinging Shot, with a removal spell that's so far better than really any other removal spell in the whole set in many ways, you're just like, wow, what a blowout. Like, I did not see that coming. Holy crap. Right? Same thing with the example we used earlier with, when you build around an enchantment of some sort, especially an expensive one like Sandworm Convergence, but even one of the cheaper ones. When your opponent cycles Forsake the Worldly, it doesn't really register for you. But when they hit your enchantment with that in the main deck, and they're totally correct and fine to have played that card, it's not like they took on a whole bunch of risk and just happened to get there. They're just sort of doing what you do in the format. It feels like a blowout, right? You're like, Drakehaven, go. They're like, untap, Forsake the World. You're like, oh my God. It's like, it's game 1. That's my only Drakehaven. I was going to do so much cool stuff, and now I'm just blown out of the water, right? My whole deck has really been crippled by this play. And I can go down the line with, I mentioned the Threaten, the +2/+0, these type of cards that, normally you don't consider or don't need to play around. When they do get played to great effect, it feels like a huge swing, against or for you, depending on which side of the battlefield you're on. So it's really strange for me because it's almost like they put cycling on these cards, which you would think would reduce the variance, but through play feel, it feels like it's higher. It feels like I could get blown out at any time here. Is that a weird, is that just a psychological thing I'm feeling?
No, part of it is real in that you are right in that more these cards that are great in narrow situations see more play. So you're going to see more of these spikes where this card is insane. You're going to get threatened more often. You're going to get +2/+0 to all your attackers more often. You're going to get disenchanted more often because those cards are just cards you can put in your deck. So that part, I think, is definitely real.
Okay. And then what does that say for incentives? Because am I supposed to still build around Drakehaven and Sandworm? I mean, I haven't let it stop me, but I do just worry, like, am I just dumb for doing this? Like, is this just a mistake?
I still think you are. Like Drakehaven and Faithfully Devoted, for example, Sandworm Convergence, I think these cards are all very good build arounds, and I would still build around them. They just fail at a higher rate than they normally do, which is kind of unfortunate because they're sweet cards, but I think they're still worth it.
Okay. They failed at a higher rate, but not high enough to make you be like, I'm off it. I'm not doing it.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. All right, you may carry on. I had to get that off my chest.
Yeah, I think that's all just very relevant. And then the last thing about it is that cycling payoff cards have felt pretty strong to me. Cards like Heckma Sentinels, Horror of the Broken Lands, Shadowstorm Vizier, even Pitiless Vizier, because every deck just has cyclers. Like, you don't have to be a cycling deck. Like, a cycling deck exists. You know, I've drafted a bunch of decks. You've drafted a bunch of decks that we would look at it and say, like, this is a cycling deck, capital C.
I have, absolutely.
On the other hand, Heckma Sentinels has just been good in every blue deck I've drafted. You know, it's just a good card. So
I agree.
You don't have to be a cycling deck to utilize these cards, which just indicates how prevalent and strong cycling happens to be.
Yeah, threat of activation on those cycling cards is very real as well. The Pitiless Vizier that you mentioned as well.
Just unblockable.
It's just they never want to block it, and if you like go land number 5, go. Even the green decks are like, well, I don't want to just jam into that stupid thing. Yeah. So that's a very real thing as well. Okay. What about Embalm? That's one of the other big mechanics that we've got in the format here.
I think that this actually has less of an effect on the format than, well, first of all, than cycling, because there's so many fewer Embalm cards. Also, just it's a little bit less impactful than I thought it would be. Though it is impactful. Like, when you play against Embalm creatures, you do feel it.
I found it way less impactful.
Yes, I don't think the two are particularly close in terms of overall like metagame feel. Even though during the set review, because we don't have quite that view yet, I think we probably oversold exactly how much Embalm mattered to the board.
Definitely, yeah.
It's another way to fight Mana Flood because it gives you bonus 5 to 7 drops that just come out of your graveyard for you without a cost of a card, which is nice. Like, Aven Initiate is a very good card. So it rewards stabilizing. I have not found Embalm to be relevant against aggro unless you have like one of the 3-drop Embalm cards or something like that. Yeah,
the 2/1 is fine against them. Like, it often trades and comes back. Yeah,
but for the most part, you're not embalming. Very often against aggro.
It's slow. It's really slow. Yeah.
It's more like the kind of ability that helps you beat aggro once you've stabilized, because you're just up two bonus cards on them.
Mm-hmm.
And I've seen cheap embalmers actually like the Talkrop Skirmisher, the 2/1 that you mentioned, letting you just throw away creatures in like go wide attacks, and that's been kind of interesting to me. It also supports the zombie theme because they're of course all zombies when they come back, and it means that cards like Sacred Cat find their way into zombie decks at a higher rate than they would if they weren't zombies. So,
by the way, Sacred Cat has sucked. I see it a lot. I see it played a lot, and I have never. Every time I play it, I'm like, why did I do this? This card is just a non-factor way too often for my liking.
I thought it was better in zombie decks. Like, it's about as good in zombie decks as we thought it was in general, and pretty bad outside of that.
Yeah.
So, but I think it actually has been good in zombies specifically when it's just triggering Binding Mummies when it comes back and that sort of thing.
Binding Mummy's been good.
Binding Mummy has been way better than we thought. So that's going to make it onto that list.
Definitely, for sure.
So one of the things I actually kind of want to ask you is how aggressive do you think the format is? Because I'm actually not sure. Like, I have died to aggressive decks and I have drafted aggressive decks, but I've also played a lot of matchups where neither player is doing anything.
Yeah, so I found it like that too, that things are polar. But I think that, I don't think that, like, the way that I tend to define how aggressive a format is how aggressive is the deck that you could see often, right? It's sort of like, if you go to any format, the question, like, sometimes you see Zendikar-like formats, which is like most of the decks are just aggressive, and you would just put a blanket statement and say that is an aggressive format. But what I usually find is if there's 1 or 2 viable aggressive decks, those set the bar. Because if you have a good chance of facing either of those 2 decks in a draft, it limits what you can do. Casting 8 drops and stuff like that starts to become really sketchy when you know damn well that if somebody drafted the blank deck, usually it's red-white or something like that you could just be dead. And in my opinion, in this set, you can be very aggressive, and I think the aggressive decks are good, and they're very scary. They have a lot of ways to steal victories from you out of nowhere, and they have a lot of ways to push in damage, mainly through Exert, because Exert is a really good aggressive strategy. If it's the attack that kills them, you don't care if your creature untaps, right? And you are able to leverage Exert creatures either in unison with each other or just on their own to push through damage in the late game. And then oftentimes to push through large chunks of damage in the early game. The combat tricks are good enough to get damage through. And then, like we've talked about before, you have these cards that are normally very conditional that aren't anymore because of cycling that you can happily put in your deck. And if you get to use, the threaten effect to steal their creature, is it Pursue Glory or whatever? Or maybe that's a +2/+. So anyway, either of those can absolutely steal a victory. And you've got some really strong comments that help. Binding Mummy stands out a lot as one that's just super annoying.
White Black Zombies has felt like a very real, a very aggressive deck.
Agreed. Totally. And, a lot of times when you're trying to do the slower stuff, it's funny. You mentioned the cycling deck, right? And I've drafted that deck multiple times. I've drafted, it primarily been blue-black, but when I've had it, it's funny because I've ran into matchups that I felt like I could not lose. Like my deck just did stuff that was tough to interact with and gave me inevitability. And I saw so many cards from my deck that I would always get to my good ones. And I felt very advantaged. And then in another matchup, my opponent played Binding Mummy into 3/2 Vigilance, Embalm guy. And I'm like, okay, this isn't good for me. And then they played like a 4-drop. And I'm like, well, that's game. I'm just totally dead here. And again, there's a lot of ways to push through a bunch of damage. There's a +2/+0 to all attackers. There's also the Mummy card that we got, Oketra's whatever. I'm still figuring out the names, obviously. And then, there's like the White Trial to get in for a bunch of damage. Most of the cartouches, including the white and the red one, can be responsible for big chunks of damage. There's uncommons like On-Crop Crasher that just come down and like, whoop, yeah, you can't block anymore, and you're taking extra damage. There's even some rares like we opened in our Crack-a-Pack today that just steal the game. The game just all of a sudden ends, and you were like, you thought maybe you were stable or you thought you were in a decent spot, and then boom, you're just dead. So I find this format to be quite aggressive. I think that the aggressive decks are viable, and I think they're going to be like a real factor going forward. I don't think you can ignore them.
No, definitely not. And I just think it's funny because this has felt like a very on-off, where there's the really aggressive decks and there's the really very much not aggressive decks, and they don't seem to be. This isn't like Magic Origins where every deck was plausibly aggressive, like they're just a mid-range deck and some have a lower curve than others. This is like you're cycling your Sandworms and playing, Naga Vitalists, or you're casting Cartouche of Zeal and 2-drops and attacking your opponent.
Yeah, and it's weird when those two decks come together because where do they meet? I mean, I tend to favor the aggressive decks, if my opponent is doing something really slow, just because the aggressive decks tend to be more conservative and able to put their game plan forward. But, still you'll see the right blockers from the non-aggressive deck, and all of a sudden the aggressive deck just looks completely stifled, and the late game is laughable, where they're trying to cast 4-drops and you're casting 7 or 8s or whatever that are just taking over. And again, man, I found this format swingy. I really have, play like from the aggressive player's table, right? You can have a really good start, and then they go Cartouche of Ambition, and you're like, oh no, right? They like pick off something small and hit you for 5, and you're just like, the life totals are just flying all over the place, and you feel like now I can't win. Just very, very swingy.
Yeah, and I think actually our next segment here is going to kind of contribute to how swingy this feels, and that's whether this is a Prince or Pauper format. I think it's pretty easy to call at this point.
It's very easy to call for me. It's not even close.
This is a Prince format. Like in terms of the effect that rares and mythic rares have in the format versus commons and uncommons, it is so skewed towards rares compared to like a normal set.
Yes.
And I think there's a couple reasons for that. One is that some of the best cards tend to be not necessarily better than what we normally see, but at least on par and maybe a slight bit better, like Glorybringer, Angel of Sanctions, Cut to Ribbons. These cards really stand out. But the biggest is a lot of these cards are rare instead of mythic rare. Like Noxious Gearhulk, Virtuous Gearhulk, and the Sky Sovereign in Kaladesh. These are all mythics.
Yeah.
And these cards are, like Noxious Gearhulk and Glorybringer are on par with each other, though I still think Glorybringer is actually better.
And Glorybringers are rare. Yeah.
Glorybringers are rare. Cut to Ribbons is a rare.
Archfiend of
Ithrir is a rare. Vizier of Many Faces is a rare.
Yeah.
So that's one thing. The other is that a lot of these cards are just not interactable. Like Angel of Sanctions, Glyphkeeper, Vizier of Many Faces. These all have Embalm. They play their 3/4 flyer that exiles your best creature. They play a clone on the best creature on the board. They play their 5/3 like semi-hexproof. You finally kill it, and they just Embalm it back. So
how the hell does that card have Embalm, by the way? It's just absurd. Also, let's not forget, and these cards admittedly aren't on the same level as the ones you're saying, but still they matter. The gods. They're all indestructible.
Yeah, so
like they're very difficult to interact with.
And so what that means is, like, let's take you're looking at like Ronus the Indomitable or Hazaret the Fervent, right? The red and green gods. Like, again, these cards aren't as good as Glorybringer, but they are good. Once one of those hits the board, it invalidates a lot of what is in your deck, right? If your opponent plays one.
Yes.
Where you're in a position where you either have to end the game really quickly or find something like very niche, like Cast Out, right? Not very many ways to actually interact with the gods. And that is what a Prince format does, is it makes it so yes, these games are swingy because it kind of doesn't matter what you're doing when your opponent plays a Glorybringer if you can't answer an Angel of Sanctions and you can't answer it twice.
Right. And who can, right? I mean, who can?
Right. Well, I beat Angel of Sanctions the other day because I had Magma Spray. I had to use Magma Spray plus a removal spell on it. But
wow, yeah.
But that's just like, okay.
Yeah, I mean,
also the removal spell I used was Cut to Ribbons, so I also had bombs in my deck.
Yeah, fair enough. But still, that's absurd.
Cut to Ribbons, that card's also not interactable. It's going to kill one of your creatures and then eventually going to kill you.
Yes.
These cards are just very difficult to deal with, and there's a lot of them. It just feels like a higher concentration of cards that are like closer to a 10 on the scale than anything else. And how
about Samut, Voice of Dissent? How about Sandworm Convergence? Sure, it's 8 mana, so it doesn't go in that same category, but that card's very difficult to interact with as well, right?
Yeah, that one I think is okay. Like Sandworm Convergence, the reason I wouldn't put it on the list is like your opponent got to 8 mana, like they did so.
They should get something. Yeah,
right.
I agree.
You're talking about like Samut, Voice of Dissent, or
Regal Caracal.
Any of the cards we just mentioned, they tap 5 mana. Like, good job.
Regal Caracal is absurd for 5 mana. Even another one, and again, this one does require work, so I don't think I put it quite in the same level, but it's another one is Approach of the Second Sun. If you find yourself in a slow matchup, how do you interact with that? I mean, I don't need that answer to me. I know you can counter it or whatever, but like that's hard to interact with, you know? Thank you, Louise.
It's just a pattern of once. It's not that I don't think rare should be good, and I actually think it's very healthy for a limited format to have first pickable bombers that you're excited to open. It's just
totally
when a lot of your games are ended in a manner where you feel like a lot of your cards didn't matter, or a lot of your opponent's cards didn't matter. Like I had a draft that went really poorly, but I had a Glorybringer, and I ended up going 2-1. Right, and I have 19 playables in my deck, a bunch of like Scarab Beasts without cycling payoffs, just bad cards. I'm sure every opponent I beat with Glorybringer that looked at like the 2 unplayables I cycled and like the random, bad creatures I cast, like the triple dung beetle I cast or whatever, and they're thinking like, none of these cards matter, but I guess they had a Glorybringer, so I'm just going to lose. So.
Right. Yeah. And the list goes, I mean, we open Insult to Injury. That's another one that's just like, bang, game over. Liliana Death's Majesty.
There's just very little. So I really don't want this to come off as like me and you just sitting here complaining about the rares we've lost to.
Not at all.
We've had a lot of these rares in our deck too. I've had Glorybringer 3 times so far.
I approached of the Second Sun somebody. Like
it's more that when you look at what the gameplay these cards add, like Angel of Sanctions and Glorybringer and Cut to Ribbons are just cards that, they tend to make the game focused around them, and that's fine. You're going to have some amount of cards that do that. It just feels like the actual number is pretty high here, and because a lot of them have Embalm or are hard to deal with otherwise or indestructible, there's less of a, answer. Like Aethertide Whale was a good example of the last format of a card that everyone just like groaned, right? That was like on the groan test.
Totally.
That was like, how many cards
it won it for the set review.
Right. We talked a lot about the reason that Aethertide Whale elicits groans is that there's no way to deal with it. You think you're in a good shape, and then they play this, and you realize you can never win. So when I look at Amonkhet here, and there's just like a lot of cards that have that power level and similar ways of protecting themselves, again, Embalm, indestructibility, what have you, it just means like there's a lot of groaning. Like that is just higher than normal. Like I did not feel this way in Kaladesh. In Kaladesh, we didn't have our initial impressions and talk about how dumb it was to lose to Noxious Gearhulk because look, that happened some of the time. It was a mythic, and a lot of these the good rares in the set were not cards you couldn't answer, like Untethered Express from Ether Revolt. This was our mythic uncommon, right? This card's great. It's so hard to beat, but you can also just shatter it, and that just happens some amount of time, or Daring Demolition or what have you. Like, that just does not an answer for Vizier of Many Faces.
Right.
Like, they play that and you're like, oh, that card's going to be a 6/6, but then I'm going to kill it, and then what? It's going to be a 6/6 again, or better, maybe something better.
Right. And, I think that part of, I'm glad you brought this up as a way of to say, look, we're not trying to bash the format at this point, because I've been drafting it and really enjoying it. And I like it a lot. What we kind of, at least I know I do, I'm sure you do too, we're kind of view ourselves as stewards for this stuff too. Right. And I'm looking ahead. Right. And I want to see a healthy, fun draft format. And these are red flags for me that it might not be. Now, it might also just sort of all work out. Right. Like these things are hard to predict, generally speaking. And so for me, this is more of a discussion of noting these things early and being aware of them, so that when the format starts to really mature, we have a better approach to it, a more well-rounded approach, and not just going in blind, rather than saying this condemns it, because it doesn't necessarily. It's just things that, again, raise your eyebrow this early in the format. The truth of the matter is, though, that I will draft any format, and also when a format first comes out, there's so much sweet stuff for us to discover and try out and do, and we're all doing that. And so that part always works. No matter how bad the format is, you can get through that. It's when you get a month into it, are we still enjoying it? Is there things that are really like, oh no? Or are there things that are like, yeah, I know this is a new thing that I discovered, or a different path I hadn't taken before? And that's the kind of stuff that we're really referring to here is, well, how does this format look in a month? And these are things that might make it look not so great. And that's just the truth. And, here on LR, we keep it real. Like, we're not going to sugarcoat it and be like, oh, every set's amazing, everything's great. We talk about reality here, the things that we really like about sets and the things that we don't. We try to do it in the most fair way that we can. And these are the things that have been occurring to me while I've been playing. And I can tell that a lot of them have to you as well, Louis. So interesting stuff. And of course, we love the discussion, right? One of the huge things that we love about Magic as a game is the discussion around it. And this is just another one of those talking points for us.
Yeah, I have been enjoying the format. I've been drafting a lot of cool decks. I think that we're likely to get into more deck specific stuff in later shows where we break down and lay out skeletons for these decks. And trust me, there are some sweet stuff going on. Like, this format does have a high capability for sweetness as well. These are, like you said, just some of the things we have noticed in our first week and a half-ish of drafting the format.
Exactly. Did you have anything else you wanted to hit? That was it for me.
No, I think that was the first thing to TLDR it, to put some clip notes on it. Having cycling in the format means I think playing 16 land is going to be more often the correct number than any other number. And you end up with a situation where your expensive cards have cycling, so you don't have to run the risk of missing your 6 land drop as much, so you can play one fewer land than you're used to. Mm-hmm. The cartouches are good. We had the official cartouche power ranking of green, black, blue, white, red.
Exactly. Yep.
and I certainly agree with that. And you not only get to play more situational effects because of cycling, you get to play against more situational effects. So that can change your valuation on cards or strategies that get blown out by those effects, but also change your valuation on strategies that want those kind of effects, like the go wide +2/+0 sort of thing is a lot more relevant. And as for format speed, there's fast aggro decks and there's slow do nothing decks, and there seem to be fewer decks in the middle, though I guess the green, black, -1/-1 counter deck feels like that kind of deck. So,
which, by the way, is my favorite deck.
Yeah, mine is blue-black cycling, and like I said, we'll get to those decks later, but that's our initial impressions of the format for now.
Of course, we want to know what you think about it, too. You can find us on social media and let us know. I'm Marshall_LR, and Luis is LSV. What's been your experiences? You've been destroyed by bombs. Do you care? Does it affect it? How have you been liking cycling? Have you been finding that you've been flooding out? Have you been cycling too much? Have you been not cycling enough? Let us know. And you can do it through that. If you want to support the show directly, you can do so via the Patreon, patreon.com/limited resources. And of course, the show's brought to you by channelfireball.com, the place to go on the internet for everything you need Magic related. Please do check them out. They help out the show, and we appreciate you giving them some patronage. And we also know that when you go there, you're going to get solid prices. You're going to get quick shipping and great customer service too. And, that's just a few of the things that you can get at channelfireball.com. If you want to find everything related to the show itself or to the hosts of the show, you can go to lrcast.com. That has links to everything. We try to cast a pretty wide net for stuff for the podcast. So like there's a link to the Facebook page. If you're big on Facebook, if you're on Facebook all the time, you can like that. And then I basically only post when we put up a new episode of the podcast. So you'll just get a notification that says, hey, the show's up. Real simple for that. Of course, I mentioned Twitter before. We both stream, twitch.tv/LSV, twitch.tv/Marshall_LR. All of these links are on lrcast.com right on the front page so you can find them and get to what you want to get to. So with that, thanks so much for listening to our Amonkhet First Impression show. Next week, we'll dive a little deeper, maybe even get into some color pairs and stuff like that. We'll see you then.
So today, I actually want to talk about something that I've been asked about enough that I feel like it's worth sharing. Well, there's going to be some disclaimers, but I'll start with. So, Marshall, when you first met me in 2011, is that right?
It was in 2011, I remember.
So I was quite a bit different. I actually lost a lot of weight in the intervening years, and I kind of want to talk about like some of the methods I used to get healthier, because I think getting healthy is awesome. And so here's my disclaimers. I'm not a nutritionist. Don't do anything without consulting a doctor or being comfortable doing it. I'm just going to talk about my personal experiences and what worked for me and some of the people I know, just because I think it's useful. I think that there's something that that could be gained, or in this case, perhaps lost from that.
Yeah.
And because I have generally, it's less necessarily about weight, though that can be a metric you track, and more just about feeling better and I think generally being happier. And so I think the biggest thing for me is that I just don't eat much sugar anymore. I think sugar is one of the leading causes that I found of basically eating too many calories and not feeling as good. Mm-hmm. So a lot of the changes I made just involved finding easy ways. And look, this is still LR. This is still how I approach things. Still how you approach things is min-maxing, right? Trying to get the most value you can.
Oh yeah, small edges.
And once I started learning more about this stuff, like it is not good value to drink 700 calories of soda a day. It just is not. Like I love food. I still love food, and I still like eating plenty of food that is not great for me. But by kind of looking at ways to spend my calories, I end up not wanting to use it on sugary drinks. So basically all I drink would be like, coffee, unsweetened iced tea, water, that sort of stuff. So that I think was, or, sparkling water is fine too. Like that sort of stuff is pretty easy, right? Just don't drink calories.
And that's like a huge, before you hit diminishing returns, right? I mean, that's just a huge gain for like not that big of a loss.
Yeah. If you're looking for something and you drink a lot of soda, it's actually like, you're actually really lucky. You have a very easy out.
Yes, very much so.
So that is a big part of it. The other is that I cut a lot of like just refined carbohydrates out of my diet. So you're talking stuff like bread, potatoes, and rice. I don't eat a ton of rice. I didn't really like rice to begin with, so that part was easy too. And ate a lot more just vegetables and protein. So I actually ate at Chipotle a ton when I was at my strictest. And the reason is, and it sounds like a joke, but it's actually not, is that if you get like a burrito bowl, I just got like grilled chicken, guacamole, salsa, and beans. And I found that to be filling and not incredibly high calorie. So you can end up like, I think the biggest thing for me was a perspective shift. I was not, and I still don't, like, I don't diet. I'm not looking to go on a diet. I'm looking to just change how I approach eating and change how I approach food, because the idea is like, it's been 6 years now. The idea is not, I can do this for 6 months and lose X pounds, because that, from what I can tell, is not effective. Like, you will lose some weight if you stick to it, but then you'll gain it back when you just revert to your old habits. Or you'll go through life feeling like you're deprived, right? Feeling like I'm dieting, I can't have the things I want. And it's not something that appealed to me. It's not something that I found particularly useful, and not something I thought I would stick to. So I just wanted to kind of reframe how I ate. And again, I mean, you've eaten with me plenty of times. Sometimes I eat healthy and sometimes I don't. It's not like I'm, super strict, but I found that in general, striving to eat meals of some kind of protein, some kind of vegetable, and not a whole lot of carbs has been effective. Some of the things I found that are really good are avocados. Avocados are super healthy. They're very satiating, so you can have an avocado and feel very full, even though, like, if you eat a bunch of chips, for example, like, the amount of calories in a bag of chips is just like absurdly high for what you get. It's just not very good value. So I found ways like eggs I've really liked eating. I have eggs for breakfast almost every day because they taste great and they're I believe good for you. Again, I'm trying to impress upon you that I'm not claiming anything besides what has worked for me. So
sure.
I found a lot of value in finding sources of food that are healthy and taste good, so that I feel like I'm not depriving myself. I feel like I'm satisfied, but I also have noticed a lot of health benefits to eating a diet composed normally of, like, again, vegetables, protein, avocados, beans, eggs, that sort of stuff, and salsa, like not a lot of sadly tortillas, bread, rice, potatoes, sugar, just in all forms. And that so far, I think it's improved my life. Right now, I know it's improved my life quite a bit, and it's something that I tend to, again, be a little more relaxed about than when I first started. But I think that was also necessary too. Trying to make a big shift requires, first, I think, moving as far as I could, and then seeing what worked for me as a consistent basis. And now I just do. That's just how I live. Like, again, I will eat ice cream. I love ice cream, so this is still something that happens. But I can't, for example, fathom the idea of like drinking like a Coke, like just a normal Coke, right? Like, I just can't imagine just drinking a soda like that. It just does not occur to me. It'd be like smoking a pack of cigarettes, right? It is not something that I want to do. I don't smoke, to be clear. And similarly, like eating a bag of chips is just not something that would even really occur to me at this point. Like, and I think that it's just a shift from how I used to think, how I used to eat, and how I used to be. And I found it to be really rewarding. So I think that there's a lot of resources you can look at and a lot of different conflicting information. I guarantee you pick a thing, someone will tell you that thing is good or that thing is bad, like when it comes to nutrition. So I at least am convinced that sugar is quite bad, and I am very happy with the results of just eating a lot less of it. So hopefully that's useful to some amount of people, and that is the experience I've had. So I can offer my lived experiences.